before you post that. If you can't hear me, raise your hands.
Okay, so far so good. Okay. So I want to situate this further back. So David Bach ignited a debate that had been going on already for 7 centuries. And so I found it very instructive to go back to the beginning of the debate. And this is just a word for graduate students and students. I think it's really helpful to pick as a thesis topic something that's been debated and not some marginal question. And because a debate that lasts 7 centuries shows you something really deep is at work. And so it comes up, it started with St. Thomas. St. Thomas brings in the existence of a natural desire to see God to answer 2 questions. One question is it possible to see God? And he answers, well, there's a natural desire to see God. How could a natural desire be in vain? It must be possible. But he brings it again in a different place in the Summa to answer a different question. What is perfect happiness? Perfect happiness must lie in the fulfillment of all our natural desires. Is there some natural desire that nothing, what's the highest of all our natural desires? And again, there's a natural desire to see God, a desire that nothing natural can satisfy. And that shows us that perfect happiness that exists must lie there. But at the same time, St. Thomas has a bunch of other articles in which he says, he quotes St. Paul, 1 Corinthians 2:9. Eye has not seen, ear has not heard, it hasn't entered into the heart of man what God has reserved for those who love him. And so St. Thomas sees it hasn't entered into the heart of man. And what is that God has reserved? The vision of God, the vision of his face. And so St. Thomas argues that it's above all natural desire. It's above our innate inclinations. And so that's the problem right there. We've got this natural desire, and yet the object of this desire is above our innate inclinations. After St. Thomas doesn't give a resolution to that, as far as I know. And so Thomists and non-Thomists, Scotus, jump in on this question, right? So Scotus, in a couple decades later, weighs in, and then at the time of, in the 16th century, the commentators on St. Thomas tried to solve this problem, and different solutions will weigh in on one or the other side of those 2 series of texts. There is a natural desire to see God, or the vision of God is above all natural inclination because it's something proper to the divine nature directly. And so that kind of sets the stage. In the 20th century, this was hotly debated among Thomists in the first few decades of the century, with different underlinings, and de Lubac entered in and radicalized the question. And maybe I'll turn it over to. Do you want to?
Oh, sure. Am I audible as well? Yes?
Yes.
Yes. See, I'll ask this correctly. If you can hear me in the back, just raise your hand. Okay. I'm waiting for first call. That's so well put. I'm not sure how much I can add to it, except just to add a fruitful note of dissonance. It could be the case that a debate persists for 7 centuries because the terms in which it's framed are so inherently defective that what one produces is an insoluble conundrum. No, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that polemic, but it is possible, and that was perhaps Henri de Lubac's first intuition, that we were locked into a theology. Catholic theology had, since the Baroque period, been locked into a set of, at least as he was taught by manualist Thomists, into a set of tidy divisions that though neat and convenient, perhaps distorted what you could say about the revelation of God in Christ or the revelation of God in creation. And he wasn't the only one. I would point out that the turn against this style of theological formation shows up in a number of figures. In some ways, the critique is more powerful than Bernard at certain points, and sometimes in, say, Chenu breaking away from Garrigou Branche. But what made his method different was being of the ressourcement generation, he undertook a reading of Thomas forward from the past, let's put it that way. He tried to make Thomas the Thomas he wanted to emerge. I agree with Larry that you're never going to get a completely satisfactory interpretation of Thomas on this question. There are aspects of his thought and of his language which lend themselves quite powerfully to either position. On the one hand, you can say things in the Summa Contra Gentiles, especially in the compendium, about the natural desire for God that seems to leave no room for a natural end that's anything more than a way station, sort of proximate exemplary way station on the way to the beatific vision. On the other hand, it's the Thomistic tradition that embraces the idea of the limbus infantium, that allows for unbaptized babies to escape Augustine's dreadful sentence of eternal torment and instead go to a place of perfect natural beatitude where they will never suffer a sense of lack, because being unaware of what they do not possess in the beatific vision, they do not desire. So you have plentiful texts on both sides. So de Lubac's program, in a sense, was to read Thomas as an interpreter of the patristic tradition. His reading, his first edition of Sur Naturel, is absolutely saturated with citations of the Greek fathers and of Augustine. And from that emerge, as the conversation progresses, we can argue the fine points, but what did emerge from that was a deeply enriched view of Thomas from many. It is true, even if we want to avoid caricatures, that theological formation through the manuals did have a deadening effect on a generation or two of scholars. And de Lubac opened the possibility of getting past the interminable struggle over these oscillating antitheses, as they come to be thought of grace and nature, first gift of creation, second gift of sanctification, by reading Thomas as someone who has inherited a patristic tradition in which these divisions have not yet made a conspicuous appearance.
Can I follow up on that?
Yeah.
And pose to Larry, you mentioned the patristics. Can I pose to Larry, what is the place of the patristics? Ought students now not only read Thomas, but read the fathers, or Thomas sort of synthesize at a higher level patristic wisdom? What comments might you have on the place of patristics?
Well, certainly, I think one of the great things to say about St. Thomas, what makes him such a great formator, is that he so profoundly read the Fathers. And that's the way Leo XIII speaks about Aeterni Patris, quoting Cagita, that because he read them so deeply and loved them so much, he was able to transmit them. So obviously we have to do the same task today. We have to read them as he did. And we need to, they're always going to be, by being closer to the source, by being so deeply pastoral, liturgical, biblical, typological, they're always going to be the privileged source for theology. And so, basically, I think it's so crucial to have the whole, Ratzinger in the Regensburg lecture, I think it is, speaks about how we want to embrace the whole. Right now. But I think it's so important to take from each period of the church's life a unique contribution. And so it's unhelpful to patristics versus scholastics versus silver scholasticism versus Tridentine. We want to take from each period what its proper contribution is.
Though we may not want to take quite as much from every period as every other.
Granted, sure.
And do understand, I mean, that is part of the protest, in a sense, of that generation, is the way they were receiving their theological formation did not do that. Thomas, who was treated as the synthesis of this tradition, who had extracted from it everything nourishing and spat out. But it was the manuals about Thomas, made up of pericopes, epitomes, condensations, occasional cartoons for illustration purposes, maybe. But, and so, I mean, there's just quite apart from the details of theology and metaphysics, there was a real longing in that entire generation to return ad fontes. It was the high point of the renewal of patristic scholarship in the Catholic Church in France. And I'll just say, I mean, again, he made a persuasive case that Thomas can be read with the fathers as a true inheritor of that tradition, who could still be creatively used to advance that tradition of thought. Whether he got all the details right or not.
Maybe we'll move into some of the theological points. And the evidence for natural desire for God, again, our focus question, is often framed in terms of being sort of found in the intellectual capacities of the human person and this ongoing quest for meaning and truth and goodness. So I'll pose the question to David this way. Can rational consciousness be anything other than an absolute desire for God? Can rational consciousness be anything other than a natural desire for God?
No. The question actually is from a letter, right? I mean, it's already Ludoc writing to Maurice Blondel.
Right.
And his point was not that rational consciousness explicitly at all times and in a way that it can thematize desires the beatific vision, but that implicitly, tacitly, and primordially rational will, rational consciousness cannot be anything other than an orientation towards the vision of God. So radically so, and actually, I don't think Ludoc was sufficiently radical on this, at least not after promulgation of Humani Generis.
And quickly, Humani Generis, you want to say, is the...
Well, it's an encyclical that arguably, in part, is written with an eye to Ludoc's first book, Sur Naturel, cautioning, well, not cautioning, but prohibiting a certain too extreme statement that the supernatural desire is a natural possession of the rational will, or a natural desire of a supernatural end, put it that way. But what I would say in response to that question is that consciousness is of its nature, and Ludoc is a great reader of Brentano and all this, is of its nature intentional. It's a necessarily ecstatic movement towards an end in nature, but an end in nature to which it can be intentionally related only because primordially it's related to a transcendental horizon. Truth is such. It's not just the case that our desire for God is elicited by the mysteries that arise in our encounters with the world. I see a teacup, I want to know who made the teacup. I see the world, the same question occurs on a somewhat larger scale. I start wondering about God. Rather, it's the case that I can't recognize a teacup at all. And I certainly can't desire to know what it is or where it came from if I do not already have an orientation, a sort of insatiable desire for, an intellectual appetite for truth as such, as a transcendental that is directly convertible with all the others in the simplicity of God. And so my natural desire, my natural orientation, intellectual or voluntary, moral, is always already directed towards a supernatural end, and for that precise reason it's a rational desire. That's what rational consciousness is. It allows me to receive the world within the embrace of a primordial intuition that's insatiable with any natural object. It could never come to rest with a finite natural. And we know this anyway. We know that if we think about it, we find nothing in the world that's desirable simply in itself. I mean, we may think we do, but we find that whenever we try to explain our desire for something or our love for something, there's a deferral towards a transcendental explanation of why. I love a certain work of art because of I think this Bach's second unaccompanied violin partita is a vision of God because there's a natural orientation towards the beautiful as such, which no natural object can satisfy. So that desire for the supernatural is the basis of natural desire, is the basis of natural knowledge. And I think that's the point that Deleuze wanted to make to Blondel, who of course agreed with it entirely. It was often me,
Actually, I agree with Andy.
This is really boring.
Sorry. Sorry. Because I think you've articulated very well what could be misleading in simply saying that the human spirit is absolute desire for God. The way it was you've just articulated is simply showing that we have a natural inclination as rational beings for, we could say, the transcendental, for the true, the good, and the beautiful. And not just for, and I think Plato did this so well in the Symposium, where there's this, it's about love, and there's this dialogue now between a priestess, Diotima, and Socrates. And she has him go from desire for beauties, the beauty of the landscape, the beauty of the human person.
The beauty of Alcibiades.
Right, okay. And,
let's be honest.
That's right, that's what it's about. And to go to, well, what would it be like to see beauty itself, capital B? How could you not want that? Isn't that where all these other desires are going? And right there, Plato is fleshing out the natural desires he got. And it's interesting, in Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho, again, he talks about his conversion, and he speaks about how he ran into these various philosophers, but it wasn't until he met the Platonist, who, again, opened the same horizon of a desire to see the truth of capital T, to see beauty. That was philosophy. That was the philosopher's quest. And what they're just pointing to is that's the quest of all philosophy. And we could go further. We could say that's the quest of all culture in some sense. And well, I grew up an atheist, but as Randy mentioned, sculpture was important. And I have this sculpture I did as an atheist with my wife. And afterwards, after our conversion, I could see, oh my goodness, the whole meaning of that sculpture was my wife's desire to see the face of God. And I think that's the motor of human culture, and I think this is de Lubac's contribution here, is pointing to the radicalness of this desire as, I think, the motor of culture. And again, this is, I'm sorry, we're agreeing too much on this, but for the purpose of debate.
Argue about that. Well,
Right.
let me ask you if I can.
Go ahead, sure.
Yeah. So the issue, though, that's often the way it's posed in the debates, which tend sometimes to be more polemical than probative, is that the desire for God, full stop, so for supernatural union with God, full stop, as opposed, it is to be counterposed to natural desire that merely elicits by experience this further desire. That is that often we have it presented to us by advocates of a certain form of the commentary tradition, that this is a secondary or superadded desire impressed by sanctifying grace. But within the realm of natural desire, the desire for God is elicited, is consequent upon the questions that arise from finite experience. Whereas what we're saying, though, seems also to be a good fundamental notion. We don't want to get our ordo ascendi and ordo cognoscendi all mixed up here. That desire for the supernatural is not only elicited, but it's primordial, it's original. The desire for the supernatural end within the embrace of which it then becomes possible to say that this is green tea or this is a dog, and because my desire for knowledge, for loving knowledge, orienting me towards that end, makes natural experience a possibility, a rational natural experience. And so, how deep is the priority of this desire for the supernatural?
All right, let's see if I can do justice to that. The way I want to answer that is by, it's crucial in theology to make distinctions. And so what I want to make here is a fourfold distinction of the desire for God.
So he is a Thomas.
Sorry. Now, a first distinction, the way to explain the terms. David referred to elicited, and the way the debate usually goes, elicited as opposed to innate desires. And an elicited desire is one that's elicited, in other words, drawn out by knowledge and experience. So the way that St. Thomas describes the natural desire to see God, it leads you to think he's speaking about a desire drawn out by coming to realize that there is a God as the truth with a capital T, beauty with a capital B, or the first cause, however you want to conceive of it, and I don't yet know him as he is. And therefore, I want to know him as he is. How could I not? And St. Thomas expresses this as simply coming from what we could call an innate desire, something that is simply the very nature of the intellectual faculty, that it desires to know causes, and especially the first cause, and not just to know them, but to know them in their essence. And so the elicited desire to know God in his essence, to see him face to face, is coming out of innate desires that are simply the nature of the intellect, to want to know causes, to want to know essences, and to know them perfectly. The reason why the Thomistic tradition threw a question in here is because innate desire is also equated with another notion that I want to throw in, and that's proportionality. So for Thomas himself in many texts, and then the commentators, they will equate an innate desire with a proportionate desire. In other words, my intellect moves, yes, to know causes and essences, but insofar as a human intellect can know them, and that's through creation, through the mirror of creation. So that would be the innate desire, as it were, of human nature, understood as proportionate desire. To know God, yes. So our innate desires are always directed to God, not just to a closed, creation. To God, but to God as he can be known through the mirror of creation. The elicited desire goes beyond that, because I want to know not just God as I can know him, but why wouldn't I want to know him better than the created intellect can actually know him? Through the mountaintop, through the experience of friendship, and I want to know better than that.
Well, let's put it this way. Could there be a reality in which rational intellect suffers no elicited desire, or nothing beyond an elicited desire, and does not actually concretely desire God as God?
Could happen.
Yeah, you see, whereas I would say that's a logical impossibility. That's like a square circle. And the reason for that, I mean, again, I want to go back to this. It seems like a very fine point. And maybe it is. I mean, it can be that we're approaching this from two angles of incidents that just look the same. But when you say one of the causes, and this leads you on to one of the first cause, the point that Blondel and de Lubac, and in a different way, Eric Shivara, and Bernard Lonergan, and Karl Rahner in one way, is that even the desire to know causes, if I may frame, that even the ability to recognize the very concept of causality already occurs within an intentionality of consciousness and desire that is irreducibly oriented towards the vision of God. And yet it can't be fulfilled proportionately by natural ends. And so the response to that is that in say, an Aristotelian cosmos, in which we wouldn't even make the distinction between natural and supernatural anyway, except in terms of location, what's in the empyrean and what's in which we have fixed essences oriented towards a natural completion, which they'll either reach or not. We talk about proportionality naturally as a form of causality. But if we're talking within the framework of creation from nothingness, in which beings are created specifically to be for union with God, and rational consciousness as a strange teleological exception to limited final causality, because rational consciousness of necessity desires the whole of being and can never be satisfied with less than that. So the reason it's asking about causes is the reason it's able to recognize that this cause is not yet final, this cause is not yet final, is because the desire for that one true final cause is the ground from which all the rest arises. If that's, are we bound to the notion of proportionality in a world created from nothingness, in a reality in which rational beings are called out of nothingness into union with God as the very ground of their existence? They can't give themselves being, they can't give themselves their final end, they can't give themselves their conscious desire. And so they want to press this point to its radical end and say that no, actually, it's not even logically possible for rational consciousness to be satisfied with the natural end, because that's just not what rational consciousness is. It is of its nature a participation in God's knowledge of God. It is of its nature. It is, and can be nothing else other than that movement of created being towards the full disclosure of being. It is nothing other than that. I'm just going to keep doing this. Nothing other than that. Well, every other side of being is being in its fullness is manifestation. So that's the language. And that's why they push back against the notion that the supernatural end within the natural frame can be understood only as elicited, as consequent upon a desire for causal explanations.
Let me add this second. So I mentioned 4 levels of this. So I just gave 2. Thank you. So how does this change? God gives us 2 things, revelation and sanctifying grace. And that changes the desire to see God radically in 2 complementary ways. When God reveals himself, and this is in Revelation, we get a beautiful encounter of what man naturally desires, to see the face of beauty, and God revealing that that's exactly what he is coming to bring us to. And that's the gospel, the good news. The gospel is that there's a meeting between this natural desire and God's desire. Right? And that revelation changes the desire, because it gives that desire now a foundation to think that it can be realized. So I think that's really important, that the philosopher, Aristotle or Plato, thinking about this natural desire to God, I think they're thinking about it, that would be great if this could be, which is a kind of conditional desire. Now, I can imagine you may have something to say about that. But Revelation changes that. Now I don't seek it as something that would be nice, but I hope for it in the firmest way, as something that I believe that God has promised. And then a new thing enters when God gives his sanctifying grace, sacramentally. Because receiving sanctifying grace, I receive a share in the divine nature, a participation in his nature, and therefore a mysterious proportionality with God's own end, such that that end, the beatific vision, now is, I can't understand this, I can just, that's what we do in theology, we stammer with these mysteries. We've been made somehow proportionate to God's own end, seeing his face. And therefore, once I've been brought into a state of grace, I now do have an innate desire in the sense of proportionate, mysteriously, to God's own end. And thus, that desire, even though it was there from the beginning, and even though we can agree on its being the foundation of, in some sense, of everything, now has been realized in me in a new way by grace, as something proportionate rather than infinitely disproportionate. And so that's how I want to.
Yeah,
We'll come back.
Yeah, and I think this, and this is where so much of the stress and struggle over these issues tends to arise. Because what would be granted from the other side is, yes, the fulfillment of that desire is supernatural and therefore exceeds natural capacity. But the desire was always already for that supernatural fulfillment and could never come to rest in natural satisfaction.
Perfectly.
You know,
I grant you.
yeah. And, but you know, this was an argument that Lubac did have with some of his opponents. Was, you know, and the thing is, actually, Lubac conceded here, I would say, more than he needed to or should have, because he granted that it was conceivable that God could have created a frame of reality in which a rational nature terminates without sanctifying grace, without the vision of God in the natural satisfaction, and that would have been in itself sufficient.
Can I follow up on that?
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking about a natural end, and one of the hot-button issues in this conversation is the question of pure nature. And furthermore, de Lubac thought that, you know, positing that or positing this natural end really, ironically, or you might say, people would argue with this, led to forms of naturalism or atheism or secularism. Any comments on that? In other words, is it partly the theologian's fault?
Everything is, because we're the most important people. Can I start?
Sure.
Well, actually, that ties into what I was about to say. It's just that again, for de Lubac, for Blondel, at least in the early period of de Lubac, I can say that actually it's logically impossible for that sort of natural reality to be appropriate, even if proportional to a rational nature. A rational spirit is a completely...
Hey, David, speak up just a little bit.
A completely different sort of teleology. But as for that issue, I'm always leery of these genealogies. Not that I haven't engaged in them myself. The problem with genealogies is what one person's consequences is another person's cause. And you know, one person's pathology is another person's therapy. The problem with that is I don't know, and it's, you know, like Heidegger, the entire history of the West is reducible to 100 texts of philosophy, which apparently calls all of history. And you know, in the theological world now, this is, you know, we've gotten in the habit of doing this. Duns Scotus ended reality for us, and created Wall Street. This, however, I mean, this was a deep concern of Henri de Lubac. So whether, let's not say this notion of pure nature, which I'd like to talk about, you know, in a more systematic way, but not whether simply whether it somehow calls modernity, but at least whether it's complicit in the history, with the history of secularization, in which it became possible to think of revelation, say, as something that erupts into history from above. So the revelation becomes reduced to the fact of Scripture and the salvation history, and that there's breaking continuity between nature and revelation. There's breaking continuity between social order and the revealed nature of God. You know, the corpus mysticum, this is a great concern to do about. And then this entire notion of a natural realm sufficient unto itself, he felt was, however extravagant his rhetoric got, at least part of the pathology of modernity. That we have not seen the transcendent within every instance of the immanent. We have not granted the openness of the immanent in every moment to the transcendent as what constitutes it. And again, as for cultural genealogies, if I'm talking to a Marxist, I'll be an idealist, and to an idealist, I'll be a Marxist, and I'll say it's all material conditions. But whatever the case, he saw a sort of troubling consonance between a separation of thought in the spheres of sanctifying grace, what is revealed in Christ as the true end of nature, and then a nature that could be sufficient unto itself without being oriented to what's revealed in Christ. So that Christ then does not become the revelation of what nature is. Christ becomes the revelation of a purely gracious superaddition to nature that makes it intelligible perhaps in a new way, but that is not required to make it intelligible all the way down. He wanted our sense of reality to be absolutely saturated in the sense of the incarnate Logos. What we make of that in terms of actual historical sequelae, I can't say. I'd like to think that we're the movers of history, at least me. You can do whatever you want. But I suspect that that's not really how it happens. I think that the ideology is, to some degree, a superstructure of material conditions. Modern age, with its rising middle class, is a mercantile philosophy, it's an understanding of the divine right of kings, perfect state sovereignty, is a material and social reality to which ideologies really begin to conform. It's also why the idea of divine sovereignty in the early period begins to displace other names for God, so that sovereignty can become higher than love as a name for God in both Catholic and Reformed and evangelical traditions.
Larry?
But that's very general.
Okay. Well, I think this is a good example of what you mentioned earlier, that it's important to frame a debate rightly. And a badly framed debate can be unfruitful. So I think posing the question as a question about the possibility of pure nature, could God, what do we mean by that? Could God create human nature, rational nature, without calling it to a supernatural end of the vision of God? I don't think that's the right question. I think that there's a more fundamental question.
But it's a question we do have to ask.
Okay, yes, and I do want to ask it as a corollary. But I think a first question is, does it make sense to speak about a connatural end in distinction to the supernatural end? And I think that does make sense. And it's not a hypothetical. Because what we're saying is, this human nature that I have is a reality in me. In addition to this human nature, addition is not the right word, but I believe I've received sanctifying grace, which gives me that intrinsic proportionality to a supernatural end. But this human nature that's in me as a reality, is there a connatural end that's proportionate to it? And what would that be? I think that's a really important question. That's one of the most fundamental philosophical questions, a question asked by Aristotle and Plato. What end corresponds to human nature as it became known without the benefit of revelation, which they didn't have? And St. Thomas weighs in here and says that, well, the ancients, Plato and Aristotle, got this one right. The connatural end of human nature is contemplating God through the mirror of creation. And so the end is God, but the way of contemplating is through the things made. Is that a perfect end for a rational creature? Here we'll agree. No. Of course it's not a perfect end, because it leaves a natural desire unsatisfied. The one that we've been speaking about, the natural desire to see beauty face to face. And so St. Thomas is saying two things here, and I think he's right in saying this, that we can speak of a connatural end, contemplating God through creation, after this life, as he imagined for the children who died before baptism, that before the age of reason, without baptism. So a beatitude that's in God, but that is imperfect. And how imperfect? Well, you could say in some sense, immeasurably imperfect compared to seeing God face to face. But not, and for that reason, nothing. And not for that reason absurd, because it's, so simply speaking, imperfect, but in some sense, perfect, in proportion to human nature. But simply speaking, imperfect, because leaving unsatisfied this natural desire to see God. And thus St. Thomas comes out with two ends possible for a rational creature: the supernatural, simply speaking, perfect, and a connatural, simply speaking, imperfect. And that's crucial, I think, for architecture in doing theology. And I think we'll have more to say about that in a minute.
It does raise an interesting question, because we usually hear that the paradox that the Nouvelle Théologie wants to raise again and again is an irreducibly natural desire for an irreducibly supernatural act.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's not true that Duluth did deny a connatural end as well. But then, if you say also that that leaves an innate desire imperfectly fulfilled or unfulfilled, it does raise the question if we're really talking about a connatural end that satisfies at all. Because, again, and I'm speaking here as an advocate for this Nouvelle Théologie tradition, but also for myself. But I say, if the prior orientation of consciousness and will towards God is what makes possible the desirability of natural ends, then any degree of satisfaction with natural ends is so imperfect that it could never be understood as any kind of fulfillment of human nature, which would mean then that human nature, natural desire, is for an end to which its nature is not proportionate except through grace. Now, that would only be a paradox if, as we feel obliged we must do, we make a sort of dialectical distinction between grace and nature. And I think this, you bring this up, one of the questions you talked about was whether naturalizing the supernatural was one of the problems here. Well, let me just say on the question of pure nature, and then just move on. Maybe as a provocative comment, I'm willing to retain the category of pure nature under the form of an impossible possibility, or a remainder concept, in good Reinerian Teutonic form. Let's say this. I think of pure nature in the way I would think of pure nothingness when I speak of creation of nothingness. I don't understand these as two terms in a dialectic. I understand the idea of pure nothingness being evoked as that which is always already overcome in the act of creation. Or the way I think of materia prima and form. So that prime matter doesn't have an existence in itself apart from its formation, but it does serve to individuate form. That's the sort of relationship I think that we should allow between the notion of pure nature and grace. The very first moment of creation is an act of unmerited grace. It is a calling from nothingness, a rational nature to union with God. And when we introduce caesuras into that, rather than just way stations, well, here's a proper stopping point, but then a second gift has to be superadded. That we're doing something that I think is coherent within a certain Aristotelian framework. I don't think it's a coherent phenomenology of consciousness and desire. And I don't think it's necessary or appropriate for a theology of creation from nothingness, for faith in the incarnate Logos, who is not just an event that God, when God becomes human, what is revealed? I would say that end that is the only possible end for all creative nature, all creative rational nature. It is that union towards which what is called from nothingness is called from the beginning. And so, the problem of pure nature, it's a vexing one because we'll agree on great deal, but the degree to which that category serves a useful clarifying purpose is going to be different. Again, I want it to be pure matter, pure nothingness, pure nature.
Brief response, Larry?
Yeah, so, and this is another question that was going to come up. I would just say that I think it's crucial that there, what's that mean? St. Thomas Aquinas, in the Treatise on Grace, in the Summa, in explaining the notion of grace and why it's called grace, mentions that grace is grace because it's doubly gratuitous. In other words, there's a double gratuitousness. And I think this is one of the key points here. That the double gratuitousness of grace comes from the fact that God didn't have to make me out of nothing. So that creation ex nihilo is obviously utterly gratuitous. Nothing can't do anything to merit being made something. But in addition to that first gratuitousness of being called out of nothing, there's another gratuitousness that's equally immeasurable, and that's being assigned a supernatural end, an end that's proper only to God, to see God as God sees himself and to love him as he loves himself. And that can't be proper to nature, to any created nature. And so that's simply because of the proportionality principle. Now you may just simply reject the law. So that's really perhaps the issue that's...
The proportionality principle hold for rational spirit. And I'm not even sure I would say it doesn't, because I'm not sure I wouldn't say that the proportional principle holds for created spirit, and the created spirit has as a proportionate end that it could have as a proportionate end of God. Or just, Gregory of Nyssa, the infinitely growing soul into the infinite knowledge of God is a proper end. But this is the thing. This is what I'm saying. What I meant about a 700-year debate being premised upon certain divisions that we take as constitutive of the argument, but they're actually negotiable. One is the principle of proportionality, which is absolutely crucial to an Aristotelian cosmology, without question. Not to a Christian one necessarily. That's debatable. But another is that in order to assure the gratuity of grace, we have to create a kind of supposition or supplement, a prior foundation of a concrete nature of the self to which grace is added. So the first grace has to be supplemented by a second grace, a sanctifying grace. I don't see that as a necessary concession to me. I rather say that the act of creation and the act of salvation are one thing. They are a calling from nothingness of rational spirit to union with God, who being the only exemplar of rational nature can be fulfilled. Yeah, we should record this and make it a stock.
There we go.
Yeah, how's that? That's better. And again, I think this is this is one of those parts of the debate that's never going to go away. Do we need a concretum of nature in order to make grace truly gratuitous? If we didn't believe in creation from nothingness, if we didn't believe that rational nature is constitutively the image of God, destined to be conformed to the Logos, yes. But as we do believe that, we don't. I'm just going to anticipate the question and ask it to it, which is, one of the claims that was made against the Nouvelle Théologie was that it naturalized the supernatural, that it made it, that we deserve the vision of God. Now, there are two answers to that, which I like to provide, and they let me tear me apart. One is the question of deserved merit is misplaced. We can all agree that we merit nothing. We don't even merit existence. All of this is grace. All of this is gratuity. What the Nouvelle Théologie replied was, we have not naturalized the supernatural. We've recognized the supernatural constitution of the natural as the inevitable final end, the inevitable ultimate end of created nature. Actually, I'll stop there because I don't know.
Okay. Well, so, this is really leading to a question, what are the implications of this difference? I mean, I think that's basically the heart of this debate, religious implications. So obviously, the gratuitousness of grace is a key question. And David Bach himself, in The Mystery of the Supernatural, written in 1965, in chapter 5, comes out and says, yes, we have to hold a double gratuitousness. What's that? Which one of us is that? And
lean back. Just stay back.
sorry.
It's like the last sequence in 2001. You know?
In Humanigenics, which we refer to, Pius XII says that some have denied that God could create rational creatures without ordering them to the supernatural end, which position would destroy the gratuitousness of grace. Basically, so that's the magisterial position, that we need a double gratuitousness to preserve the full revealed sense of the gratuitousness of grace. I think that's the key question, that grace is a revealed notion. What do we understand by God's grace? And I think part of that understanding of grace is that it's gratuitous on top of nature. In other words, nature itself is freely created out of nothing, but there's a second gratuitousness. And I think this perfectly matches, maybe perfectly is not the right word, with simply the Christological paradigm, that as in Christ, there's distinction of two natures without separation, but the distinction is something crucial. And here too, I think we want to say in the Christian, two levels, the natural and the supernatural given by sanctifying grace. And those two ends are in some way parallel to the constitution of Christ himself. And I think that one could go one in two opposite ways. An Nestorianism that would separate them, and a Monophysitism that would conflate them. And so my concern is a supernaturalism here that would be too much conflated.
Yeah, no, it's funny. Christology is actually a central issue at the moment. It's often not the case. But of course, there we're not talking about a union between the supernatural and the natural, between the divine and the human, which is, you may say, a distinction without difference, but it isn't. What happens in Christ, according to what became the Orthodox reception of Chalcedonian Christology, is that Christ is the only perfect human precisely because he is also God. This is Maximus the Confessor, after all, none greater than he. What is revealed in Christ actually is not a super addition to the human, but a recognition of the fulfillment of the human. Now, that it happens in the case of Christ within a divine hypostasis rather than a created is a distinction. But that the essential end, the proper end of the human is this union of natures, and that a rational nature short of this union has not been fulfilled even as a nature, is I would think, the real necessary conclusion we would draw from Orthodox Christology. One of the concerns that say, Hans von Balthasar, but also Karl Rahner had, to take both wings, was that the revelation of God in Christ would be seen as something incidental to the whole structure of created being, rather than the revelation of its true end, which also allows for Christology that's not paradoxical. That is, in becoming human, God did not undergo a metastasis. It's not a magical transformation. There's no conflict between the divine and human natures, not because some sort of mediating created grace has been posed between them that allows for union, but rather because from the beginning there is no conflict. Human nature is already an instance of the participation of the divine nature. So you get into Christology, you might get radically different conclusions being drawn. Yeah, no, please go ahead.
Okay. Larry, I'll allow a response from you, and then I want to pose two related questions and then open it up for our audience.
Okay. I would think this might be a place to pose the question about obediential potency, because basically that's what we're speaking about here. And that was one of de Lubac's big critiques of the Thomistic tradition, is that he thought that it made it, so Thomists speak of an obediential potency for elevation. In other words, human nature, something, human nature is kapax Dei, capable of God, because it's rational, precisely from a rational constitution, and capable of being elevated to receive a capacity that's proper only to God. And that's in human nature from its very constitution. So I like to call that a specific obediential potency, an obediential potency specific to the rational creature that makes him capable of God. And I think we would agree on that. But de Lubac saw that above all as kind of a capacity to receive a miracle. And I don't think that's not the way it should be understood. And that's not I think the proper Thomistic understanding either. That because we're naturally open to truths, and we have even that natural desire to know the truth with a capital T, that's a sign that we're capable of being elevated to receive precisely that, even though it's beyond human proportionality. So in that framework of the principle of proportionality, there's something that's allowing for an opening to the disproportionality, and I think that's crucial to men.
But isn't it curious that violates the whole premise of proportionality, because it's implicit in human nature, not, I think, simply as something added to a rational nature, but as part of the constitution of a rational nature.
Yeah, but this is
which means that what you call an obediential potency is what someone else might call, the necessary openness of human nature to supernatural.
Right, it's not something added, so we're in agreement on that.
Right. So then the principle of potentiality of proportionality is already proved to be inadequate to express.
I guess it's inadequate in and of itself, right? It needs to be complemented by those principles that stress also the incredible fittingness and openness from the start in God's presence. So I think that's kind of what we want to, because we want to get a synthesis out of this. And I think to make that synthesis, we want to stress, on the one hand, the distinction and give proportionality its proper place, but also point to those principles that allow for the overcoming of being imprisoned within our proportionality. And that's the gospel, right? And so what is it in us that prepares for that?
I wonder if that aspect, that turned out again and again not to be a real point of contention, didn't it? Because everyone was willing to grant that there are unnatural ends of some variety or other. It's whether, and again, it becomes a matter of degree, the degree to which you posit a possible final satisfaction in those conditions for a rational nature, and the degree to which rational nature could be constituted as a desire for those ends alone.
Right, it would still go, so in St. Thomas' mind, and in the Thomistic tradition, even if one were to only have had it accessible to one the natural end, there still would have been a desire going beyond. But St. Thomas argues not such a desire that would preclude a true resting, but which would preclude a perfect resting, simply speaking.
Can I shift gears to, I have two questions, but I'll pose one to bring us back to the ground. And I don't mean that in any way, but literally here at the university, okay? We're in a university context. Can you speak to any implications for the question of the natural desire for God, the relationship between the natural and the supernatural for a university, right? Something that seems to be a pretty high-minded debate with fine distinctions. What does this mean on the ground as we think about the relationships among disciplines at a university?
We must defeat them.
It must be PhDs.
Okay, well, I would say it's crucial for so many reasons. We have to get the architecture right to think. Thinking wisdom is being able to order all things. And in ordering all things, we need to keep the supernatural final end as obviously the ultimate goal that gives intelligibility, so we're in agreement on this. And we also, I think, want to keep the principle of proportionality, and thus the idea of nature having a consistency of its own, but a consistency of its own, which by its very nature is constantly desiring that which goes above what nature can realize, and that being, as we said before, the foundation of culture, of philosophy, of the arts. And so I think that the architecture here that we're trying to sketch out is crucial. And in this architecture, the natural desire to see God plays an absolutely fundamental role of connection between the two orders, in such a way that we can, at one and the same time, take very seriously and lovingly the created order with its own, as Guiding in Space 36 speaks, it's a proper autonomy of created realities, but not such a proper autonomy that would be closed in on itself, as if the creature could exist without the creator.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to disagree with that, or add much to it, actually. We have seen, and this is especially true in American universities at the moment, moves towards understanding all of the humanities as justifiable only in terms of the skills they impart that will make us successful as businessmen and businesswomen. There's no ground for the integrity of the humanities as a movement of human desire, curiosity, human spirit towards a single encompassing end. Look at the curriculum reform debates at Notre Dame right now. You would think that the humanities as such have no content. And that if they do have content, they're utterly disparate from one another. So, it's absolutely crucial, if you're going to take a Christian approach, at least to the university, to understand that the integrating principle has to be a final cause, a final end that is capable of embracing every dimension of humane culture and experience. And that's necessarily supernatural. And there's no natural object in which those possibilities come to a fruitful conclusion as one. Unfortunately, again, we live in the age of universities being turned into vocational technical institutes, in which the humanities are a kind of embarrassing adjunct to the business schools. Just one quick anecdote, all right? I just say this, it's not though, it's not that the humanities have done a good job of integrating themselves, because this what you call the architecture, isn't in place. The humanities have, of their own, turned into specializations, hermetically sealed against one another. There was one department once walking around with a copy of Byron's Don Juan. Not Don Juan, Don Juan. Just look at the rhyme scheme. And the head of the department, this wasn't his discipline, so he said, "What are you reading?" And I told him, he said, "What's that for?" Meaning, what class? I think obliged me to deal with poetry. And when I said it's for pleasure, he got embarrassed and said, "Well, is it any good?" So the fragmentation of humane learning into specializations without any inherent grammar of accord or common desire, common end, is something that's been going on in the humanities themselves. And now they, as a whole, are under assault by this remarkably unquestioned utilitarian American approach to education, which is that the point of any learning is to raise your profit margin. And the only way you can justify reading Don Juan is it will give you a skill like critical something, critical thinking, which will then make you much better at determining which products are likely to be profitable for your business and which aren't. Okay, so barbarism lies all around. It's called America. And I agree entirely. Now, but I don't know if it's, here I think our model would end up looking the same outside the fine points of what constitutes the natural desire for God. We agree there is such a natural desire, and we agree it must have proximate ends, it must have concrete instantiations, it must have exemplary